Nebraska 2, Oklahoma 1, Nebraska, Fan Day, Nebraska, Brigham Young, Nebraska, Florida, Nebraska, Oregon, Oregon State, Nebraska, Wake Forest vs. Santa Clara, Nebraska, Ohio, Nebraska, Washington State, Nebraska, Wake Forest, Nebraska, Santa Clara, Nebraska, Akron, Nebraska, Baylor, Nebraska, Duke, Nebraska, Creighton, Rodmeyers Invitational, Nebraska, Colorado, Nebraska, NC State, Iowa State, Nebraska, Cardinal Regional Challenge, Nebraska, Missouri State vs. New Mexico, Nebraska, Central Michigan, Nebraska, Rutgers, Missouri State vs. Central Michigan, Nebraska, New Mexico, Nebraska, Troy, Nebraska, New Mexico vs. Central Michigan, Nebraska, Missouri State, Nebraska, Maryland, Nebraska, Ptarmigan, Ram Fall Classic, Nebraska, Indiana, Nebraska, Michigan, Michigan, North Dakota State, Nebraska, Purdue, Nebraska, Michigan State, Nebraska, North Dakota State, Nebraska Golf Week Conference Challenge, Nebraska, Penn State, William Tucker Intercollegiate, Nebraska, South Dakota State, Nebraska, Northwestern Purdue, Nebraska, Illinois, Nebraska, Ohio State, Iowa, Nebraska Scarlet vs. Cream Intra-Squad, Nebraska, Iowa, Northern Iowa, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Kentucky, Nebraska, Colorado State, Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, Minnesota, Nebraska Fighting Irish Classic, Nebraska, Colorado State, Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, Indiana, Nebraska, Michigan, Nebraska, Northwestern Nebraska, Ohio State, Nebraska, Penn State. Quail Valley Collegiate Invite, Nebraska, Alaska, Michigan State, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Nebraska, West Virginia, Nebraska, Illinois, Nebraska, Ohio State, Iowa State, Illinois, Nebraska, Rainbow Wahine Invitational, Nebraska, Penn State, Nebraska.